For several sessions now, I've talked about predatory government, privatization, things such as this. One of the things that I followed now for almost 5 decades has been the law against driving under the influence of alcohol and later driving under the influence of drugs, in between driving while impaired by alcohol and then driving while impaired by drugs. It used to be you would have a police officer testify what he observed and why he concluded that was driving under the influence. And the script was pretty standard. He could detect the smell of alcohol. The person's eyes were bloodshot. He couldn't focus. He staggered. He slurred his speech. Things such as this. The real problem with that is it was pretty much a script, and jurors became aware of that. Lawyers would start out with an opening statement, for instance, and pretty much say what the officer would say and say, oh, watch this from the officer. He's trained not to observe, but he's trained to testify in a certain manner, and he will say this, that, and the other, and this is in this sequence, etc. Well, they didn't convict 100%. So the legislators with the police lobby and district attorney's lobby got the rules changed a little bit, where they had to videotape somebody doing standardized tests. Well, guess what happened? The cops still exaggerated, and the script was followed, but the objective evidence of the video cameras didn't match what the police said. So rather than have the police tell the truth, or being a little more honest in their prosecutions, district attorneys and police officers took away the video cameras, took away the video evidence. And instead of just testimony, they said, well, we need to prove something specific. Let's give blood tests and breath tests in addition to the testimony of the policeman. Well, a friend of mine was department director of motor vehicles in Colorado in the 70s. They were talking about problem drivers. And the problem drivers had blood alcohol generally over 2.0. And the law wasn't a revenue device, it was a safety device meant to keep dangerous drivers off the road. Well, what happened is pretty soon they cleaned up all the dangerous drivers that had over 2.0 in their bloodstream of alcohol or in their breathalyzer test. So they lowered the limits, and they kept lowering the limits and lowering the limits and lowering the limits until you had 1 or 2 drinks and you were guilty of drunk driving. Well, they still couldn't catch everybody, and they had all these privatized programs that they wanted people to go to, and blood tests and alcohol tests and pee tests, all of it run by private industry and not by government. So they invented another crime, and that was driving while abilities impaired. There was no research whatsoever on how the impairment affected driving ability, nor were there any empirical evidence of the ability to drive while drinking. Nobody did any experiments. Nobody fed alcohol to anyone and then put them on a machine. And you would think the best evidence would be the ability to perform, but it's not. It's all done by quasi scientific methods, not even backed by actual research, but by supposition and presumption and propaganda. Most countries in the world have evidence-based prosecution or evidence-based policy. We have propaganda-based policy. And we have all these lobby groups like MAD and insurance companies, people like that, lobby to get the penalties raised and the various substances outlawed and things like this. You would think if you're going to charge somebody with being a hazard on the road, driving under the influence, that you would at least put them in a simulator, like airplane simulators or automobile simulators, to see how they did. I think that's a little bit too simple, and probably too many people would pass. And there'd be a lot of revenue lost by corporate America. You couldn't jack up insurance rates. You couldn't charge for P-tests. You couldn't charge for all this driver stuff. And you would have to raise taxes on ordinary people instead of punishing the poor. Well, it's even got worse in the last couple of decades because they added another substance to the prohibition of driving, and that's marijuana. So you can drive under the influence of marijuana, supposedly, and lose your license, pay a lot of fines, pay a lot of corporate sponsored programs or education and things like this, and it's really not addressing the problem. Well, recently, Pennsylvania ruled that you could be prosecuted for driving under the influence of marijuana as long as THC showed in your blood test. Well, the statute specifically made marijuana illegal. It didn't say anything in the statutes originally about THC or any other chemical substance, which has caused a lot of fraud to occur, a lot of misjustice or miscarriage of justice, and a lot of not guilty people being convicted. But we as a public, as a people, don't seem to care, as long as we don't have to pay for it, as long as somebody else has to pay for it. So you might have somebody living in a rural area, not very much of a danger to anybody, and he might live in a rural area because he's poor and can't afford to live in the city or the town, has a couple beers, gets pulled over, gets arrested for drunk driving, he gets jailed, he loses his job. His family has to go on welfare, which is minimal subsistence, and all these drastic things happen to the guy. And the judges rationalize it, well, he should have thought of that in the first place. Well, not everybody could be born rich like judges. There's a lot of people should have thought of things in the first place, but they don't. And since they don't think of things in the first place, and they're poor, we're allowed to punish them. If we weren't allowed to punish them, then God wouldn't have created them in the first place, I suppose. So in any event, you've got all of this stuff going on, raising revenue. And what the whole system does is it gets corrupted. The revenue generation corrupts the system. We no longer care about law enforcement. We no longer care about public safety. We care more about the money that it generates. And we care about rewarding private enterprise for kicking the poor people in the balls and punishing them for being poor. I had a case a few years ago. There wasn't any evidence of anything regarding dangerous or illegal drugs.
Have a great day. We'll see you in a bit with that blower.
Thanks. It was so simple, I waived a jury because there wasn't any evidence of any illegal or legal drugs whatsoever. The guy cracked up his car, had a head injury, and was sort of disoriented. The judge found him guilty of driving under the influence of something, of drugs. At least that's what he claimed he thought was occurring. And after the trial, called me up to the bench and told me next time, ask for a jury. Well, that's not justice, particularly when the judge says he's going to convict somebody just because he's the judge and the county needs the revenue or something. That's a miscarriage of justice, or at least in my estimation, it has been. So what we've got is we've got a corrupt system. We've got a population that doesn't really give a shit one way or the other, whether it's corrupt or not, as long as it doesn't affect them. And we've got a dichotomous population at each other's throats. So let me give you an example of what I think is wrong. One of my doctoral students several years ago participated with me in an experiment. Right after marijuana became legal, they wanted a reason to stop people and test them to see if they've been smoking marijuana. It wasn't that marijuana was so particularly dangerous, it's that the police had this prejudice against marijuana and prejudice against long hair and things such as this. And they needed another source of revenue. So what they did was they invented the green tongue. Now, my graduate student tracked the green tongue myth down to anecdotal evidence and nothing else. He talked to the author of an article that was used with drug recognition courses to show that a green tongue was indicative of somebody smoking marijuana, which was a pretty safe bet in general, because if you give the person a blood test, the evidence of marijuana smoke is going to stay in the bloodstream for probably 30 days, which may or may not mean that he was driving under the influence of anything. So we got documentary evidence. We confronted the Department of Transportation and various police agencies or governmental agencies that have to do with that sort of stuff, and the writers of the police drunk driving manual, drug enforcement manual, the ones who qualified as expert on intoxication either by marijuana or alcohol, said that they would take the green tongue reference out of their manuals. A year later, it was still there, which means they manufactured a reason to pull people over so they could put them through various tests and give them a breathalyzer, urine, or blood test to see if they're intoxicated. Not for the purpose of safety, but for the purpose of generating revenue. And this has been going on now for a few years. So a few years ago, this graduate student and I designed an experiment. I wrote a lot of facetious articles back then in my blog posts about how cops would come up to drivers and tell them to stick out their tongues and do this, that, or the other, and then if claim that the tongue had green showing on it, and with the green tongue, that was probable cause to assume that he consumed marijuana, and that therefore he could give a drug test to see if the guy did consume marijuana. And if they found THC, then they could cite him for driving under the influence of marijuana or while impaired by marijuana, and at least shake him down for a few grand and go on to the next victim. Well, we got a bunch of, using the vernacular, patients together, and we sat them down in front of TV cameras. And we had them medicate themselves by smoking marijuana. And after a certain amount of time, we had them stick out their tongue to see if their tongues were green. We repeated this for several hours, and what we found is not one tongue in the whole group ever turned green. So I applied for funding to get a more formal experiment done and videotaped. Nobody wanted to fund it. There was lots of funding for all kinds of voodoo science that would show the opposite, but none for any real science showing this. And I think it just shows how corrupt our whole system has become. There's studies that show fingerprints don't work. There's studies that show as high as 40% of the forensic work of the FBI is faulty. We fired a state chemist for committing perjury and manufacturing test results in Colorado. The same is true in Massachusetts. And we are dealing with fear because nobody's willing to testify against Mothers Against Drug Driving or appear to fight them in any way. Judges are likely to take judicial notice of their lobby and some of their tests and results. So we've established for at least 4 decades, to my knowledge, that evidence isn't necessary to base policy on. Propaganda is sufficient, and propaganda is sufficient to put people in jail, to shake them down for money, things like this. I submit it's time for a change. We should have evidence-based policy. We should demand real evidence. We should demand that the frauds in the various government agencies quit manufacturing evidence and be held accountable. I look forward to your comments. Thanks a lot. Bye.